Fox News anchor Chris Wallace is praising White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki as one of the best press secretaries ever.
Honestly, as somebody who spent 6 years in the White House, my immediate reaction was those are two people at the top of their game. Peter Doocy has really, I think, and I mean this as a compliment, I think that he has become the Sam Donaldson of this White House press corps. And since I was working in the press corps when Sam Donaldson is there, that's a very grudging compliment on my part. And Jen Psaki, I think, is one of the best press secretaries ever. I don't know that anything was particularly accomplished, but they both gave and got pretty good.
Wallace's comments are in response to an exchange between Psaki and Fox News reporter Peter Doocy. Let's watch that exchange.
Why did President Biden say he has been to the border?
Well, Peter, as you may have seen, there's been reporting that he did drive through the border when he was on the campaign trail in 2008, and he is certainly familiar with the fact, and it stuck with him, with the fact that in El Paso, the border goes right through the center of town. But what the most important thing everyone should know and understand is that the president has worked on these issues throughout his entire career.
The Hill's Julia Manchester and White House reporter for Real Clear Politics, Philip Wegman, join us now to discuss. Julia, Philip, you're both reporters. Julia, what's your take on this?
You know, I think the natural back and forth between Jen Psaki and Peter Doocy is definitely a bit of a performance, if you will. Obviously, someone coming from a conservative-leaning cable news outlet questioning Democratic press secretary. I think both sides have to benefit from these back and forths. But look, I think Jen Psaki has impressed a lot of political watchers, especially here in Washington, with really her direct style, her very put together style, and dealing with the press. It's certainly quite a contrast from what we've seen in the Trump administration. So look, I think Fox's Chris Wallace, his praise for her really comes from the fact that both sides really benefit from these exchanges.
Phil, I guess I agree with Chris Wallace. She's well spoken. She does a good job in those press briefings. But I don't know. Being press secretary is kind of you're the chief propaganda minister for the regime, regardless of which administration you're part of. The job is to put out talking points in a way that sounds genuine and not give anyone actual information that they want.
If we're going to have a conversation, if we're going to be handing out blue ribbons about who is the best press secretary, that immediately implies that there's some sort of standard when it comes to the ideal press secretary, that we have in our minds this idea of what is the ultimate chief good for a spokesperson for a principal. And that question remains unanswered. I think that you and Julia are hinting at something, which is, what do we think the proper role of this person is? If it is to be combative, if it is to have a back and forth and to give as good as you get, then certainly Jen Psaki is one of the best. I'll also say, in my numerous interactions with her, I think that Psaki comes to the podium prepared. I don't think that she is afraid to take a question from anyone in that room. And look, we've had some contentious back and forth in the past. But if you return to the larger question of what is the ideal job of a spokesperson, what is the chief good that they're supposed to do? Is it supposed to be a political knife fighter, or is it supposed to give clear-cut answers, yes and no, based off of the facts? Well, that leads you to two very different conclusions. And I think that what was interesting about Chris Wallace's answer there is that he said at the tail end, I'm not sure if anything was accomplished there. And we've got to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of that briefing? What is the purpose of the interactions, between the press and the press secretary? Sometimes it is theater, and the last 4 years taught us that. Also, there's some theater in this administration as well. But yeah, I think that Jen Psaki is remarkably good at her job. And I think that, knowing that Jen Psaki is good at her job, it forces reporters to come in there prepared. And sometimes we get really good theatrics, and sometimes we get good answers that let us know what's happening in this administration.
And Julia, to Phil's point, in a democracy, you would hope that the role of the press and the role of the press secretary are both to inform the public about what the government is doing, so that the government can then, so that the public can then form opinions on what the government's doing, and then respond in the ways that it can, either protesting, petitioning the government, voting, etc. Are we so far gone around the bend that we not only accept that it's theater, but now are just kind of rating people at how good they are at the theater, and that's enough to us as a public?
I think in a way, I think a lot of cynics and skeptics would look at it that way for sure. Look, she is the public face of the administration. And, those reporters in the briefing rooms, especially network correspondents like Peter Doocy, are in a way the Washington faces of the network. So it's natural that this is going to be some sort of performance. They want good ratings. Psaki wants to come off representing the White House in a positive way, wants to obviously also get good reviews and ratings. So, I think for skeptics, we've definitely see this as theater ultimately.
Well, and Trump loved feuding with the media, liked having combative exchanges. I think Biden is not quite and I hate using this phrase because it is certainly not a game. You're all right, but he's not at the top of his game in giving sharp combative responses. So the role that Psaki fills is that role, a role that during the Trump years media figures came to really depend on, to have this the sparring with whoever it is. So do you agree with that, Phil?
I think so. I think that Jen and this White House are very good at driving a message that's predetermined. You do not have the kind of leaks like you did in the Trump administration, where you would have a press secretary say one thing, and then you would go to your preferred senior administration official to figure out what was actually happening. Instead, you've got a much more disciplined organization, and that starts with a principal. It starts with Joe Biden, who is not interested in getting into spats with every different little media organization. Certainly, he has his differences, but he's not interested in settling scores with the New York Times or the Washington Post. A big part of that is, by the way, that those outlets are not as aggressive with this administration as they were with the previous one. But from the president to the press secretary to the press aides and lower press, you have people who are pushing a specific message, who have top line messaging. They're following it. They're not leaking indiscriminately. I think it's much more professional. And frankly, from the professional response, your questions get answered by this administration, sometimes not always, on the record the way that you would want, or as quickly as you would want. Certainly, I've had to ask a number of questions numerous times to Jen Psaki on camera to finally get somewhere. But yeah, they're disciplined. They are, more interested in sort of getting their message out there than sort of just settling scores for settling scores' sake. And I think that, the Psaki bomb is maybe the cherry on top for, folks on the left who are looking for some, partisan bloodletting.
Well, Philip, best of luck navigating through the Psaki bomb minefield. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me.
And Julia, thank you. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.